You know, as a former Washington Post journalist, I've said a number of times that one of the biggest kicks I get in this relatively new job of mine as a bookseller is introducing erstwhile Post colleagues and other journalists. That pleasure is enhanced on the very few occasions that I find myself introducing the offspring of a former Post colleague, which is the case this evening with Andrew Maraniss. Andrew's dad, David Maraniss, a Pulitzer Prize winner who's one of the best writers ever associated with the Washington Post and author, among other works, of outstanding biographies of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Vince Lombardi, and Roberto Clemente. David and his delightfully charming wife, Linda, who's over there also, and we go back a few years to the 1970s when David and I were cub journalists for what was then a Washington Post-owned newspaper in New Jersey, the Trenton Times. In those days, Andrew was still in single digits. So as delighted as I am to be hosting him, the moment does come with a tinge of feeling my age. Andrew, like his dad, showed a knack for writing and journalism early on. As a student at Vanderbilt, reporting and editing for the college paper, he earned the school's award for excellence in journalism. He also shared with his dad a love of sports and ended up, after graduation, working in Vanderbilt's athletic department, handling media relations. From there, he went to the Tampa Bay Devil Rays for a season and then back to Nashville, becoming a partner at the public relations firm of, Andrew, I meant to ask you how you pronounce this, McNeely, Piggott, and Fox, where he's been for 15 years. It was at Vanderbilt in 1989 as a sophomore taking a class in Black history that Andrew first interviewed Perry Wallace and wrote a paper on him recounting how this former very talented athlete had made civil rights history in the 1960s as the first black basketball player in the Southeastern Conference. About a decade and a half later, Andrew decided to turn Perry Wallace's story into a book, seeing it as an opportunity to write not just about sports, but also about race and about a critical period in the history of the United States. Andrew spent 8 years researching and writing. He logged countless hours talking with Perry Wallace and many more hours interviewing over 80 others, including former teammates, coaches, roommates, classmates, and teachers, as well as family members. He also passed lots of nights at Vanderbilt Library and the Nashville Public Library, combing through old newspaper clippings and other archived records. The result is Strong Inside, a richly detailed, vividly written book that not only tells the story of one man's historic struggle to overcome incredible obstacles, but sets this struggle insightfully and instructively in the larger context of the American Civil Rights Movement. As an added bonus this evening, we also have Perry Wallace himself here. He's been a law professor at American University for more than 20 years, and he'll have a you have to try to keep it down here for a minute. And he'll have a few things to say after Andrew speaks. And one other bonus, courtesy of the Marinisses, we have basketball-shaped cookies to pass around and munch on. This may be a first in the 3.5 years we've had this store, that we've had such gorgeous-looking and thematically appropriate treats to pass around. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Andrew Maraniss.
Thank you, Brad. We've got the American University cheering section over here. I think the Vanderbilt cheering section is over here. There is any other alma maters here tonight? It's great to be here, and I was going to tell a joke about it's great to be back in the town where I went to school, and by school I mean second grade. It was Janney Elementary School up Wisconsin Avenue, where I went to first, second, and third grade. but it's quite an honor to be here at this store for my first talk outside the city of Nashville, one of the greatest bookstores in the country. So thank you for having me. So I wanted to say thank you to the Vanderbilt crowd that came out. Thank you to my parents. It's great to be in D.C. where they live, and we had a little party at their house last night, and I was very proud to be able to come back home in a way and be at their house to kick this off. The official publication date for the book is today, December 1st. And I was especially proud that Perry Wallace and Karen were there last night as well, and it's such an honor that you're here tonight. Thank you. So as Brad said, the story of this book in some ways goes back to my college days at Vanderbilt. Actually, even before that, my father was walking through the halls of Austin High School in Austin, Texas, where I went to high school, and there was a poster on the wall for something called the Fred Russell Grantland Rice Sports Writing Scholarship. At that point, I had never really heard of Vanderbilt University before, but I was the sports editor of our high school paper and applied for this scholarship. And I'll always remember my mom running over to a picnic that our school was having months after I had applied for it. She was crying. I didn't know what was going on, and she said, "Vanderbilt called and you won the scholarship." And so that was my introduction to Vanderbilt and to Nashville. And in coming there on a sports writing scholarship and as someone who was a history major, I read an article by a kid named Dave Sheinin, who was a year ahead of me at Vanderbilt, who some of you may recognize his name, his byline from the Washington Post. He's one of the lead sports writers at the Post right now. And he had written a story about Perry Wallace, which I read and was just so taken by, learning something new about the new school that I was at. And I was taking a black history course at the time, and little did I know at the time it was Perry Wallace and his classmates who were responsible for the fact that there was a black history course at Vanderbilt. And so I talked to my professor, Dr. Yolette Jones, about the fact that I wanted to write something about this person I had just learned about, and she encouraged me to do it. And so I called Perry. He was then a professor at University of Baltimore, and he took my call. And as he did so often at that stage of his life, different generations of Vanderbilt students were learning his name, and he was always very generous with his time to take our calls and tell us his story once again. And so I ended up writing 2 history papers. The first one I just noticed the other day, I turned in on November 27th, 1989, which was exactly 25 years ago on Thanksgiving last week. The following year, I was the sports editor of the school paper, The Hustler, and wrote some columns about Perry and trying to make the case that the university should name the new Student Recreation Center after Perry, which to this day is still unnamed. They haven't they haven't done that yet, but hopefully someday they will. But at that time, I was really kind of a sports nut, and my interest in Perry was in sort of the basketball side of the story. And it wasn't until 8 years ago, I was standing in the kitchen at my in-laws' house and said that I wanted to write a book and didn't know what to write about. And my father-in-law suggested Perry Wallace. You're always talking about Perry Wallace. And I said, of course, that's what I would like to do. And I emailed Perry the next day and mentioned that I would like to do this, and would he be willing to do the interviews it would require for this biography. And he said, yes, go for it. And it was in these last 8 years in researching and writing the book, and I spent 3 or 4 years just on the research side, interviewing more than 80 people, and Perry multiple times for this book, that I really started to catch on to the civil rights aspect of the story. And I hope that that's what elevates it beyond just a sports book. It's not a book about statistics and games and that sort of thing, but putting Perry's story in the context of the place and times in which he operated, and in Nashville and in the Deep South in the 50s and 60s. Perry was born in 1948. He was in kindergarten in 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education. He was a young kid when Emmett Till was murdered and was profoundly influenced by that. As a 12-year-old, he would go downtown and watch the sit-ins that were taking place at the lunch counters in downtown Nashville. We were at the museum earlier today and saw pictures. There's actually a lunch counter there, and pictures of the children, in Nashville. And Perry was living at that time in Nashville and saw all of that happening. He entered high school, Pearl High School, a black high school in Nashville, a week after Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. He was at that school for the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And Perry and his classmates who I interviewed told me that they felt like the world was changing, things were happening, things were opening up at just the right time, and that their teachers at Pearl had prepared them for this moment and to take advantage of the opportunities. That said, Perry's whole life, he had wanted to get out of the South, to get out of segregation, get out of Jim Crow, Nashville. And as a star basketball player, basketball was one way that he could do that. Not only was he a star basketball player, he was also the valedictorian of his high school at Pearl High, so he was highly recruited. It's kind of an ideal student athlete. John Wooden at UCLA recruited Perry. Several Big Ten schools recruited Perry. And he would go on these recruiting trips up to the big basketball factories of the North and the West. And, you know, in a parallel to so many news events that are happening today, he didn't like what he saw. He was looking for grass that was greener up there. But he saw especially the athletes were steered to easy courses or not even encouraged to go to class at all. And for this kid who had seen basketball as a way out, to make this decision that he made that, you know, it's not what I want it to be. And so I'm not going to do that. And his words were, I'm not going to trade one plantation for another and just be exploited for my basketball abilities. So at that point, he began to take seriously Vanderbilt University, his hometown university that had only integrated, period, 2 years earlier. It obviously had not been a school that he had considered at any point in his life until then, because they wouldn't have let him in. But on his recruiting trips to Vanderbilt, he was impressed by what he saw in terms of the players actually going to class. He was impressed that the coach, Roy Skinner, addressed his parents as Mr. and Mrs. Wallace, which he said is two folks who grew up in rural Rutherford County, Tennessee, would not have been addressed that way by too many older white men in Nashville at the time. And so it really came down to Purdue and to Vanderbilt, I would say, for Perry. And in the end, we were driving around Nashville one day. We spent several hours. Perry showed me the houses that he grew up in, the parks that he played in, the library where he would go read quite often, or he would trudge across town with his trumpet and practice 4 hours a day. We saw all the different places that were important to Perry in Nashville. And at one point he said, pull the car over here. And we were over by Metro Center for the Nashvillians in the crowd, if you know where Luby Park is. And he said, look over at that those trees and rocks over there. And there was just a thicket. And he said, that's the rock where I sat and meditated over my decision to go to Vanderbilt. And that was just an amazing moment that day to see the place that is still there where Perry made this very important decision. So at the Vanderbilt side of the story, at the same time, I should tell you, in 1960, those same sit-ins that Perry was watching, the person leading them was Reverend James Lawson, who was a divinity student at Vanderbilt at the time. Vanderbilt's reaction to finding out that one of their divinity students was leading the sit-ins was to expel him from the university. And it was obviously a very a low point in Vanderbilt's history. The next chancellor who was hired was Alexander Hurd, who was known as a more sort of New South progressive person. And he was a baseball fan. I talked to his daughter. He was a big Philadelphia A's fan as a kid and could recite statistics. And so even though he was quite an intellectual and had, I think, the strongest Savannah drawl that anyone had ever heard, he understood that the role that sports played in American life, and that by recruiting the first African-American athlete in the Southeastern Conference, Vanderbilt could signal that, and Hurd could signal that things were changing at Vanderbilt. And so he invited Coach Roy Skinner, the basketball coach, into his office one day at Kirkland Hall. And the coach thought they were just going to be talking about expanding the gym. But instead, Chancellor Hurd said, you know, Roy, Vanderbilt is now accepting black students. You can recruit one, and in fact, I'd like you to. And so that was, as Perry is then recruited by Skinner, that's the backstory to that. Meanwhile, at the same time, the president at the University of Kentucky had a similar conversation with Adolph Rupp, who was the most powerful figure in college basketball at the time, and Rupp resisted those same suggestions. So Perry arrives at Vanderbilt, and I would say full of hope, you know, that the world was changing and that this school that would have closed its doors to him just years earlier was now opening them. But things did not go well right off the bat. Perry arrives early on campus and, has courageously put himself out there to take advantage of these new opportunities. And I see Chris Woods here, another Vanderbilt basketball player. Hello, Chris. And so he goes to the University Church of Christ. For the Nashvilleians, it's where the old IHOP used to be in that weird corner near Vanderbilt. And sits there in the back for 3 or 4 weeks and is, for the most part, sort of politely ignored. Some people will come up and say, I saw you play in high school. The 4th or 5th week that he's there, some older members of the church call him aside, take him into a room, and they say, Perry, we're not racists, but you can't continue to come here. Some older members of the church say they'll write us out of their wills if we allow you to keep coming to this church. And so that's Perry's introduction to the greater Vanderbilt community. It wasn't a church that was officially affiliated with Vanderbilt, but it was right across the street. His best friend, Walter Murray, who he had gone to high school with, brilliant student himself, his first day of English class, the professor says, so they've let the N-words in after all, I see. And so this is their introduction to their new school. At the same time, some interesting things are happening. Perry's freshman year, the Impact Symposium is held, and the speakers at this conservative university are none other than Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King. And Perry was there and met both gentlemen. He later met Fannie Lou Hamer, who came to visit Nashville, and Robert Kennedy. So things were really happening. And at one point, Perry told me, even though there was a lot of sort of negative energy, there was also some positive energy, and at least things were happening, and people were talking. They were addressing important issues. So that's, there's the sort of the university setting and the academic side. And Perry's a serious engineering student with eventually a double major in electrical engineering and engineering math, but also a very good basketball player. And you might think that the basketball court would have been his sanctuary away from the craziness of Nashville. And in most ways, it wasn't. His freshman year, I write about a scene at Mississippi State, which I won't talk about tonight, but I hope you all will read. It's it's probably one of the most powerful scenes in the book. But what I did want to talk about is Ole Miss. His freshman year, they cancel their game against Vanderbilt rather than play against the team with African-American players. His sophomore year, they don't cancel the game. And Perry is down in Oxford in the first half of the game. He's struck in the face and is bleeding and is temporarily blinded in his eye, and the referees don't call a foul. They don't even call a stop to the game. It's not until the next dead ball that the team trainer and manager are able to come out and assist Perry and walk him back to the locker room. At halftime, he's left in the locker room by himself as the rest of the team runs back to the bench. And he later told the chancellor what would have been an ordinary walk back to the bench for any other player was a long, hellish trauma for him. These are the types of things he's dealing with. Incidentally, Perry came back in the second half and completely dominated the game, and Vanderbilt won handily. But it shouldn't take that type of motivation for a player on the basketball court. The rules of the game were even changed. I would argue in response to Perry and players like him. Most often, the dunk was banned while Perry was in college basketball, and most people attribute that to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, to Lou Alcindor, who was out at UCLA winning championships. But in the book, I make the case that Perry had as much to do with it as anyone. As a kid in Nashville, one of the big influences on Perry from a basketball perspective was David Lattin, who is a name some of you might know, who went on to star for Texas Western, the team that beat Kentucky in the 1966 NCAA tournament, the Glory Road game, that you may have seen that movie. Before transferring to Texas Western, he had started at TSU, and Perry would play scrimmages with the basketball players at Nashville Tennessee State University, and David Lattin, Perry described as just a ferocious dunker, and that's the kind of player that Perry wanted to be. So in that Kentucky-Texas Western game, David Lattin dunks over Pat Riley, who you all know is later the coach of the Lakers and running the Miami Heat right now. And it's quite a moment setting the tone in that game. The next year, in a freshman basketball game against Kentucky and Lexington, Perry throws down a ferocious dunk over Dan Issel, their star freshman player. And out of the corner of his eye, Perry sees an old man going crazy on the sideline, and it's Adolph Rupp. And so lo and behold, before the next season, when Perry would join the Vanderbilt varsity, that Kentucky's going to have to play twice a year, the most powerful person in college basketball, Adolph Rupp, has the dunk banned. And so, I think it's hard to argue that Perry didn't have something to do with that. So Perry continues on with his career, has a very successful career as a student and a basketball player at Vanderbilt. And as his senior year unfolds, you can sense that people are a little bit too eager to wrap up the story, to say that we did it, we've integrated, we've done what we need to do, this is over now. And what Perry knows is that things have just begun. And he said that as he approached his last game, he was thinking that he had a sort of a moral obligation to the people that would come behind him to tell them what his experience had been like. And so his last game is against Mississippi State, of all teams, in Nashville. Perry dedicates the game to his late mother. And the last basket of Perry Wallace's basketball career is a slam dunk. And the referees did not call a foul or say that it was illegal, and he got away with it. He's honored many times during that game. He had been voted Bachelor of Ugliness, which is the award for most popular student at Vanderbilt, was all SEC player, was team captain, won the SEC Sportsmanship Award. And so all these awards are coming his way. But he knows that people haven't really sort of embraced the full story of what his experience had been like. And so after that game, he received several standing ovations and, throws down the dunk, and Vanderbilt wins. And it's sort of a feel-good moment. But Perry has this feeling in his stomach that really there's a lot of unfinished business that he has an obligation to address. And he didn't have to. He could have just, not gotten into that. It probably would have been a lot easier for him. But he approaches the Tennessean newspaper. And the next day, after his last game, he spends the afternoon with Frank Sutherland, who went on to become the editor of the paper, was just a young reporter then, and tells him exactly what his experience had been like at Vanderbilt, which, when you think from Perry's perspective why this was so courageous, here's a guy that was valedictorian of his high school, was a star hometown hero in high school, goes to the local university and is a star player there, a great student. You might think that that's sort of everybody's All-American who's setting themselves up for a bright future in their hometown. Perry knew that by telling the truth, he was actually writing his ticket out of town, is what he said, and that he knew that that Nashville wasn't ready to hear the truth at that point, but he was still going to tell it. And so he gives a great interview to Sutherland. I talk about this quite a bit in the book. The next day, Monday, it runs on the front page of the paper. And Perry was exactly right about what the reaction would be. I talked to John Siegenthaler, the late great editor of the Tennessean, and to Frank Sutherland, and they said that the phones ran off the hook that day. People calling to cancel their subscriptions, to call Perry ungrateful for what Vanderbilt had done for him. And so Perry's line about writing his ticket out of town, he gets on a plane and flies up to Philadelphia, where he's been drafted by the 76ers. And the great thing about Perry is he didn't need this town that didn't want him. So he goes on to work for Ron Brown at the Urban League for a year, to study at Columbia University, where one of his heroes, Paul Robeson, had also studied law. And one of his friends, Len Berg, who Perry lived with in the Bronx, is here tonight. Great to see you, Len. Is a recipient of the Charles Evans Hughes Fellowship at Columbia. Goes on to a long career in the Justice Department and then into academia, and I'm so happy to see so many folks from American University here tonight. But what Perry knew and understood at the time that he gave this interview to the Tennessean is that people might not get it then. They might not understand that he was only just telling the truth and trying to help people then, but that his understanding of history led him to believe that someday in the future they would get it. And so it's my hope that in reading the book, we're all the people that Perry Wallace was waiting for. And that we can read about Perry and the truth that he's always represented his whole life, and learn about a hero that most of us had never known before. And one thing that I didn't anticipate in writing the book is that it would come out at a time when reading about this and talking about it seems to be more needed than ever before. And so I'm so happy that you all are here tonight, and honored that Perry is here, who has agreed to come up and say a few words and help answer questions with me. So thank you very much.
Well, good evening, and thank you to Politics and Prose. Thank you to Andrew Maraniss, and thank you all for coming tonight. I won't say a lot because Andrew really literally knows more about me than I know about myself. In going through the drafts as I did, to be helpful but not harmful, right? Because you could get in and the ego could go crazy. But I read the first chapter or so, and that described the period before my birth and at the very, very beginning. And I said, wow, is that me? And is that us? Is that how we started? What a wonderful job that this man has done, and what a magnificent service to society he has made, because he's done more than just talk about some guy. You know, there are much better athletes, and that's just patently clear. And it'd be easy to find much guys who can jump higher, run faster, give more concussions to people. And I'm sorry, that's the mischievous side. But you know, you can find that. But he's found a story that represents the kind of quality that he was about, that his family members are about, and that my family members were about. I think my mother and father would really have liked him. I think they would have wanted to make sure he got enough food and feed him. This is good old down home values. But that's it. And last night at David and Linda's house, I talked about the three things that were extremely important to me when Andrew talked to me about this magnificent journey, this vast projet, I guess as the French would call it. And first and foremost, I said there was something old-fashioned that I'm not ashamed of. He was well-raised. He had character and values, and this was as a young fellow at Vanderbilt University in undergrad. Secondly, he understood my story, and that was what a whole lot of my struggle and my frustration had been about at Vanderbilt and afterwards. He actually seemed to get it. And you know, and then of course, last, obviously, he had the intellect, the drive to see it through, and so he's done that in such a magnificent way. So I'm not going to take longer, but I really do appreciate what he has done, the way that he has done it. What comes through is that, you know, principles really do matter, and I'm not being self-righteous at all, but principles really do matter. It may take 10, 20, 30, 40 years for that to be borne out, but you know, principles do matter. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, we'll be happy to take any questions that anyone has.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Courtney Carson. I'm class of '72, and Perry, I did see you play, and was there when some of the things Andrew is describing were happening at Vanderbilt. I'd like to ask you kind of a broad question, and that is, what do you think of the state of college athletics today, especially given in light of University of North Carolina scandal, where students allegedly were going to classes that didn't exist, and so on? Andrew mentioned in his opening remarks about you decided not to go to some colleges because you felt that they were exploiting athletes. But what about in today's environment? How do you gauge what's happening now?
Mm-hmm. Well, quite frankly, there's not a great surprise here if one had paid attention over the past several decades, there were fateful choices that colleges and universities made oh so long ago about what was important. Fortunately and happily, there were some colleges and universities that made more qualitative choices. They made choices that were true to their claims. In other words, they actually walked the walk about education, about intellectual pursuits, about more complete development of student athletes and so on and so forth. And there are others that didn't. And some of the ones that didn't were a bit surprising. And the UNC case is sort of an example, except that if you have known a few guys over the years who've talked to you over a few beers, then you would understand that what has happened. Now, it's been just kind of boosted by the steroids of money. We've got Sports Inc. and College Sports Inc., but feeding on the steroids of a lot of money circulating around, a lot of opportunity there, a great deal of sort of ego boost, not only for the players, but for the coaches and for the other actors. But we have really quite an enterprise here. And so much so that it's moving along, and finding a solution is going to be exceedingly difficult, because if you think that some other institutions are too big to fail, then you try to reform this one. You're going to have to go so deep and so wide. And oh, by the way, a lot of it fits under a foundation. Just to put a little color in the conversation, it fits on a foundation of taking, to a great extent, these young kids who are from these poor communities, these poor minority, disadvantaged communities, who have, to give them credit, they tried, and their hopes and dreams, they found the easiest route, but the best route and a fun route, and they decided, and they put all their eggs in one basket, and nobody is really there. And you see that I'm pointing toward leadership, communities, advocates, and so on and so forth. All of us who talk a good game, who really don't help at the base to make sure that these young men, and fortunately now more women on the good side, thanks to Title IX, but you got to do more, to make sure that they have their values right. Because one of the things that will mean is that that when the people recruit them and tell them, as they did me and many, many others, well, how much cash do you want? What kind of car do you want? What about the townhouse? And they would farm that out. They would, these days, outsource it to the alumni and then to some of the players. Then for them, the question was, well, what kind of ladies do you like? And so on and so forth. And that was way back then. So there's really no surprise. But I guess I would say that the problem is one that has to do with values. It has to do with institutions making critical choices. And unfortunately, it's gotten really, really large, and it's going to be awfully difficult to turn around. I wasn't sure if you...
Step up to the microphone.
Okay, if I can. Need a little hip replacement, but it's good to get up here. I'm Russ Davis. I started at Vanderbilt before Perry got there and had a lovely opportunity to have a long conversation with him not long after he'd arrived. I was very impressed. And as I told you, I was very sorry that even at Vanderbilt things were not that reinforcing at that time, although I can imagine them not being. How do both of you view Vanderbilt as an institution and its growth and where it is now as compared to where it was then in a more provincial type place? And do you think it's made any good strides to improve its way of handling all human beings and civil rights?
The one thing I would say in the book, I talk about the reaction to Perry's Tennessean article and people saying, that Perry was ungrateful. I was very pleased when I interviewed the athletic director, the current athletic director at Vanderbilt, David Williams. He said Perry Wallace did more for Vanderbilt than Vanderbilt ever could have done for him. And it was with David's arrival at Vanderbilt that things began to change. Actually, it was first with Coach C.M. Newton in 1989 or 88. He invited Perry back. Perry's last game was in 1970. Perry wasn't invited back to Vanderbilt to speak until 1988, 89. And that's when this first article that I ever read was written about him, and that leads to this book. But Coach Newton had been the coach at Alabama, who was the first to have an all-black starting lineup in the SEC. He shared the Tennessean article with his players and said, let's not let this happen here. And I think that Perry gives quite a bit of credit to Coach Newton for changing things in the Southeastern Conference in general. But at Vanderbilt, it's been since the arrival of first Gordon Gee and David Williams and the current chancellor, Nick Zeppos, that there has been this outreach back to Perry and to induct him into the Athletic Hall of Fame, to retire his number, to involve Perry in other pursuits at the university, to invite him back to speak. But I would say, rather than let me give my opinion on this, I'd love to hear what Perry has to say.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Well, I agree. There has been a considerable progress. It's been important that there has been new leadership. And what also has been important is that you can pick on institutions if you want to, and it'd be easy for me to, and for any of us to do that. But the fact is that not only are they all that we've got, but they also are not just all bad. In fact, if I were to say that, well, Vanderbilt was a demon institution and they were awful and they treated me all horribly, well, I would have been pretty dumb for choosing to go there. And well, if you think about it, but you make the right choice, and you make choices as realistically and optimistically as you can. But this was a great institution at the point that I made the choice to go. I wouldn't have gone there. I was a nice guy, but I wasn't that nice that I wasn't going to go for the quality. And the story of what Andrew told you, the comparisons that I made, I looked up here and I looked there and I looked here and I looked there, and and Vanderbilt had wonderful qualities. And so what happened there also was that I benefited, as did the other black students, from that high quality experience. There were a lot of good people. There were professors and students and others. And I don't ever want the story to be told to make it seem as though everyone was a demon and a devil. There were just plenty of folks. The shame of it, and I'll wrap it up with this, the shame of it is that in the 1960s, that those conversations in the dorm, or those interactions, the guys I played with who really could have messed me up, could have left me in some tricky places down in Starkville and Athens and other places. All of this decency at a minimum, but even more. That this was a product. This was a creation. And the saddest thing is that Vanderbilt and the Vanderbilt community took it, threw it out the window, because they had trouble hearing the truth. This was a precious commodity. Just think about it. Let's talk. You're not supposed to say words like slavery and that sort of stuff, but come on now. Let's be real. Let's understand what the problem was, what was the nature of the problem, what created the attitudes, and what made it so very, very difficult for people to be even minimally civil. But in the face of that, that was the bad news. But the good news was that we, all of us who came together, often in an alternative sort of way, just the way that Reverend James Lawson and various others, and we had people coming to the campus. It was the Martin Luther Kings, it was the Julian Bonds. He sat and talked with us quite a while. I had the most memorable, not just memorable, that's not a good enough word. It doesn't make enough noise, with Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'll never forget it. And I just had to be quiet because she started telling me. I thought I knew the story, but she started telling me. And we had, for whatever magical moment, there was a one-on-one with Fannie Lou Hamer, and just talking to her about her struggles. And I said to myself, you know, man, you got to go ahead and do this. You got to go ahead and do it. If she can do what she did, and I was backing away from, because you know, you see people, and they're so powerful. And she was a little woman about this tall, and but once I realized just how powerful she was, you know, it just inspired me. But it's what was sad is that to take that precious creation in the face of slavery, segregation, and this ugly swirl of human dynamic, and throw away that progress that we made. Those of us who actually worked together, acted together, went to the movies together, you know, and the like. Just such a shame. And so now it's at least a good thing that we're picking that back up. And I have agreed, because you got good management, agreed to come back on board and pick back up in some respects with where I left off, in making a contribution, but in a safer vein.
Yes, I think they'd like people to approach the microphones because it's being recorded.
Hi. First, I'd like to say thank you very much for speaking today. And earlier today at the law school, I saw you at the panel, and it was just amazing. I want to ask you if you can elaborate on the systematic changes you've seen from 40, 50 years ago when you were the first black player in the SEC to today, where we see Harvard and Yale for the first time, both football captains were African American for the first time in their 150-year history of playing. What kind of systematic changes have you seen in the NCAA and professional sports?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly, again, as I said before, the changes have been substantial, and that's something that's always to be celebrated, and not to be sidestepped in the name of wanting to attack, you know, attack society and attack people. At the same, and I might say that it's been encouraging to me to see that we've had the expansion. We've expanded the party to more people, women with Title IX, and but still a long way to go, and to you know, with foreigners who've come over. And just a great deal of expansion and growth in that sense. It's just too bad that somehow, with all of that good stuff, we didn't find our way to fixing some of these basic problems. We didn't fix them earlier on, and so now they infect sports. They infect it all the way. They infect people's minds. They infect people's ability to see straight. They affect people's ability to care and relate. Domestic violence. I don't know if Ray is going to be led back to play, but they infect what has been an enterprise that has expanded admirably, and in so many positive ways. But what's also expanded has been the nature of the work that needs to be done.
I have a question. My name is Larry Shainman, class of '71. I had the honor to see Perry play up close because I was the stat keeper at the end of the bench. Had a really good view from down there, back behind the baskets, if you remember Memorial Gym. I'm curious, Perry, you turn on the TV now and you see Alabama play Auburn or Mississippi State play Ole Miss, and there's 10 African-American players on the court. What is your thought when you see that? Do you take a pride in having helped make that happen? Do you see it as superficial change at those institutions that's not reflected in the rest of the student body? Or just what do you think when you see what's going on in the Southeastern Conference?
Well, this won't take long. You'll hear more of the same, so I won't take as long to say it. Obviously, it's something I'm really proud of. It's something that happened. In fact, I had really turned my gaze away somewhere in the late 1970s. When you're in exile, you do things like that, and you look back here and there. I think it's just great that they're there and that the talent is wonderful and all of that. But can they read?
I'm Jason DeParle. Perry, can you tell us a little bit more about how the rest of the team treated you? You alluded to it, and also a question for Andrew. What made you want to write this book so much?
I think you can tell by just listening to Perry, if you had a chance to spend 8 years talking to this man, you'd want to do it. But I felt like it was the most interesting story I'd ever heard when I first heard it in 1989. It's a book that probably should have been written by somebody a long time ago, and I felt fortunate that it was still out there, a story that was still out there to be told. It really comes down to that. I wanted to write a book, and I couldn't think of a more interesting person or topic to write about. I didn't intend it for it to take 8 years. I was doing it at night and weekends outside of my job, and we had 2 little kids along the way. But it's I couldn't imagine anything that I'll do in life that will ever mean more to me than having the opportunity to write about Perry Wallace.
Thanks. I'm protective of my teammates, and not defensively protective, but I'm protective because I've made it clear that a lot of people didn't want to deal with the obvious bigotry and racism that was rife. It was obvious in plain view, whether it be on campus or around the Southeastern Conference. I talked about nobody ever even acknowledging it, just the play crazy moments that you have, not having the decency to even acknowledge it. And of course things like, how you doing, man? You all right? I saw the stuff. Oh man, it was awful. Oh, it was awful. How you doing? Or, I hope you're okay. Nothing. But now, for my teammates, see, the test is not whether or not they are, one, grown up, and 2, heroes. How many people do you expect? And I don't think the society can build progress in areas like race by expecting everybody to put their lives on the line, everybody to make those ultimate sacrifices and so on and so forth. What these guys did was that they were decent. There were many of them I was really friendly with. I had the sense to know to go ahead and play a big role in recruiting. And so the guys who came in saw me from the start, and I got a chance to have say-so in who were going to be my teammates. But these guys were very decent. I met their parents too, and whatnot. And so I thought they did a great job, and I needed them to do what they did, which was not to make these ultimate sacrifices. That's admirable. It's wonderful for you find it, but if you're looking for that, I think you got the wrong, what my father used to call the wrong idea. So I think they were good.
One postscript I'd add to that, if I may, is the first chapter of the book is 1 page, and it's a scene here in Washington, D.C., where an old teammate of Perry's, Bob Warren, who went on to play in the ABA for many years and had many black teammates in professional basketball, kind of finally dawned on him what Perry Wallace must have been going through at Vanderbilt. And so it was nearly 40 years later that he happens to be on a business trip to Washington. He makes his way over to Professor Wallace's office, walks into the office, and he says, "Perry, forgive me, there's so much more I could have done." And to me, that was just a very dramatic scene, and I believe that's happened in a few cases, either with teammates or fellow students of Perry's from Vanderbilt, who, as Perry said, maybe took decades, but they've gotten it eventually.
Thank you, Andrew, for making us known a hero with courage, with success. So this means that our society is not only about killing and animosity. Forgive me, Perry, I don't know much about sports, but I would like to ask a question from Andrew as a writer and a historian. What was the most challenging aspect of the story you were writing, and how much could you relate to the story that you were writing?
The second part first. In some ways, I was able to relate to quite a bit of. I had a great teacher, who could talk to you more about race in America than in a better way than Perry Wallace. And so he's been my teacher for 25 years. Since I was 19 years old as a student at Vanderbilt. I wouldn't say that I don't know, this might sound bad about the challenges. I didn't ever approach anything as a challenge. To me, it was just all very interesting, and I loved working on it. And so the chance to talk to 80 people about what life was like back then was fascinating to me. The chance to go to the archives and dig through old newspapers, I loved doing that kind of thing. I spent 3 or 4 years just on the research side, which was fun for me. The writing part was fun too. I guess the challenge was just trying to finish the darn thing, and knowing that this man who had spent so much time with me and had been so generous with his time, and whose story needed to get out there, that I just wanted to get it out there, and trying to squeeze it in between kids' naps, or late at night. Little 10-minute windows, and it's pretty hard to write a book in 10-minute windows, but it just took a long time. That was challenging. Coming up with a title was challenging. I didn't expect that. But I hope that Strong Inside, the double meaning of that, comes across to people, who's stronger inside than Perry Wallace. And then as a basketball player who was playing in the paint, he was pretty strong as well.
Thank you.
Well, excuse me. I want to say thank you both for Andrew for writing the story, and to Professor Wallace for telling the story. I'm a 2013 graduate of the law school at American, and I had the honor of being a student of Professor Wallace's corporations class. And it's a challenging task to make corporations interesting. But you did a really good job.
I got an exam for you. See me after.
So my question is kind of a follow-up to the first question that you answered, because you identified some of the issues with college sports, particularly college basketball, and some of the challenges with athletes, in the education, and I think one of the solutions that has been presented and it's been fought in courts is about compensating the athletes, and I wanted to know whether you thought that was a good idea. What are the challenges that you see surrounding that, and just want to get your sense on that issue. Thank you.
Well, I don't have enough knowledge. I keep up. I try to keep up, but I know enough to know that when I don't know enough to talk about a thing, not to try to talk about it. What I do want to say, though, is that maybe these 2 points, and then I'll be quiet. One, I'm glad that the various lawsuits and the debates and whatnot are coming along to shake things up, because it that the community, and I love it, but it needs to be shaken up. It needs to be shaken up and required to have to respond to some of these obvious needs. The second point is that And this has to do with a lawsuit that one of my colleagues at the Washington College of Law at American University has just filed with some other lawyers representing an former athlete at UNC, at the University of North Carolina, suing about the failure of the institution to provide a proper education. It would be nice to see more of the lawsuits and other initiatives be directed more toward the student part of the student-athlete title. I mean, I hope that that the people can get proper cash and that there can be the right and requisite financial arrangements and so on and so forth. But I would like to see there be more action that says we want to make sure you really get a fine education wherever you go to college and so on and so forth. And sure, we can work out some financial remuneration. My final point is a little cynical, I will admit, but it has to do with the fact that you've got this corruption, and that's really the right word, that we find in too many places, not every place, not every institution, but you have too much corruption. And part of what that means is that I don't care what is the financial arrangement that is made. If you shoot them more cash over the table, then there's still going to be a whole lot more cash down here under the table. And I'll sit down.
Okay.
So my question is about narratives. And one of the things that I find both in film and in books is that there's always this very powerful device of sort of the individual and sort of overcoming adversity, and which is such a wonderful narrative. And I actually think that sports in a lot of ways is sort of the ultimate overcoming adversity narrative, just because of sort of the physicality of our bodies and so on and so forth. And so that you have to sort of overcome your own limits in order to be good at a sport in that way. And so I guess what I'd like to at least, I'd say that, not David, but Andrew, sort of talk about what you feel like in sort of, I have not read the book, right? But how you use that the narrative of sport and adversity in the book in terms of trying to relay larger messages about courage and perseverance and so on and so forth.
I think one of the challenges with this book and with any sort of sports book is that the narrative of overcoming obstacles can be too easily arrived at by people who assume they know what the story is. You know, and most people, even Vanderbilt fans, they might see the banner hanging in Memorial Gym with Perry's name and number on it. That might be all they know. They might just have read a sentence that, you know, he was the first African-American player in the SEC and assume that they know a little bit about what challenges he would have had to overcome. And I think, you know, my one worry about this book is that people will assume they know the story before they even pick it up. And so that's what I spent the most time really thinking hard about in writing the book, was not to make it just sort of formulaic sports book about an athlete who overcomes obstacles on and off the court and you think you know the whole story. So that's why it was important to do as much research as I did and as many interviews, and to spend time going back and back and back to Perry to get the true story about what happened and why it was so important to talk to his sisters and his roommates, his coach, just as many people as possible to paint a full picture. You know, people thought they knew the narrative in 1970 when he graduated, and that's what Perry recognized too, is that they really didn't. And so I felt it was my job in the book to, to relay the feelings that Perry himself felt about that, but then in other ways to expand it into the future. I know it was very important for Perry that another aspect to this question is, I feel like in most movies or books, it would end with that slam dunk against Mississippi State, you know, as the triumphant conclusion to Perry's career. But the triumphant conclusion to Perry's career hasn't even probably arrived yet. You know, I know that he's as proud as himself as a father and a husband and a professor, certainly more than he is as a basketball player. You know, it's almost ironic that it's a picture of him on the cover as a basketball player when athletics is not what defines Perry Wallace as a man.